a little aside about Henry David Thoreau. He came, visited, he walked up the mountain that's on the other side of the Connecticut River, the Montasticate. He came back down, he walked up and down Main Street, and he said, best thing about this place is that mountain. And so he was not very impressed with the civilized or uncivilized nature of our Main Street when he visited compared to where he was coming from in a more refined Boston area. So Holbrook was a model. James Fisk, you can see the Revere House and James Fisk there. Another person who was great at marketing. And he went from selling wares out of a carriage to becoming a cotton mill owner and eventually a financier in New York City. And all of that, again, was modeled for Estey as he was watching how other businessmen were operating in the community. Estey's house, you may have passed it, it still exists. It's on Canal Street. The photo on the left is definitely an older one. But this is part of Estey's appeal, is that he started from not much. As his businesses grew, he continued to prosper, but he didn't go big. He didn't go beyond what was going to be reasonable for the community. So he purchased this property. The home that he bought from the plumber was the one he lived in until 1854. He took that home down and then had this one built. Not very ostentatious. It's still an apartment building now in the community. His children went big. They went for mansions, but he tried to stay a little closer to home, I think, in that regard.
What number Canal Street is that?
I couldn't tell you.
But is that
that blue
current
house
picture?
is still there? Yeah.
Okay.
It was. Yep, that's a photo actually from the real estate sale that took place about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's still that color. So when you travel on the road, you'll see it. In 1850, Estey had been, he was not just a plumber and running a plumbing business, a lead pipe business, but he'd also branched out. He was selling lumber. He was also investing in the granite trade. And so he was trading lots of things. He was more than just a plumber. He was also involved in business and trying to find the right businesses to run things and to make money. And so he built this structure in 1850. It's where the co-op is now on Main Street. If you've been to the co-op downtown, there's a plaque there for Kyle Gilbert, who was a veteran who died in war. And so there's a Kyle Gilbert memorial there. And that's about the place where this building was located. You can see on the right, it says Jacob Estey Lead Pipe and Pump. And then on the left, you can see on the second floor, Estey and Green, the organ making company. And he had up to about 18 employees up there building organs at that time. The first organ, and this is, again, some of you who are organ historians, you can probably fill in some blanks here for me, but the first organ manufacturers in Brattleboro were these folks, Samuel Jones, John Woodbury, and Riley Burdett. And they began manufacturing organs in 1846 in Brattleboro, and it was actually on the Whetstone Brook, but further west, off from William Street, what used to be known as Centerville. Maybe some of you have gone to the Vermont Country Store or the Vermont Country Deli out there, on Western Avenue. And so if you go back a little ways from there on the Whetstone, this building, the footprint for this building still exists. It's now an apartment building on the Whetstone. But these men began making melodeons by hand on the third floor of that mill. Things that, when I was thinking about doing this, I was thinking, all right, I need to make a list of what were all the things that Estey did, which maybe allowed him to be as successful as he was. He believed in all these things: mechanical innovation, advertising and branding. He believed in having his company involved in local government, not trying to influence it negatively, but making sure that local government was in support of the things he was trying to do as well. Being involved in community, embracing technology, proprietary secrets. Any of you reed enthusiasts? The whole technology behind the construction and the making of reeds. And I don't see anybody raising your hand. Isn't this, that's what we're here, this is the reed organ, right? So, all right, okay, all right. So that was the secret, or if there was a secret to, one secret to Estey's success, this might have been it, was the whole, the reeds that went into his organs, were the quality of those reeds, the consistency of them, the secrecy that went into their production, and the implementing them into their instruments. When they advertised and said they were the best organ manufacturer in the world, and they said that their quality was the highest, and they were willing to put a number on each one of their organs in order to say, that's ours, and we're counting them. That's how much we care about what we're making. It was going back to, how could he do all that? And one of the ways he could do that was because of the science and the technology that went into the reeds that he was producing. He wasn't producing any of it. He had workers who were doing it. His religious conviction, I think, really, it's interesting for our community. Brattleboro was a hotbed of congregationalism until Estey came and brought another version of religiosity to our region. And again, I think that might go all the way back to when he was a teenager and received the benefits that he did from the Baptist faith, and he, for the rest of his life, he wanted to give that back.
So did he do things to support the Baptist community specifically?
Yep, I have a slide that I'm
Okay.
going to rant on about a little bit more about that. That's a good question. So yes, it's the short answer. He also was really big in making sure his workers were cared for. One of the things that he did in his last factory that he built, the one you've probably visited, is he made sure that the heating system actually wasn't just for the wood that was being stored in the factory, but it was actually a place where people would want to work year round. So he did a lot of things, and the lighting and the heating for workers, he was sort of a leader in that, creating an environment, a workplace where people didn't mind putting in 10 and 12-hour days.
It's good natural light.
And the design of the building was such, and that was part of it, was they wanted a lot of natural light. Yeah. So you probably know that Estey had many attempts at factories here. The first one in 1857 it's on the left-hand side there. That's from Bridge Street, and you're looking sort of northwest there. And the building that you can see the white sign right here, that's the first Estey building, and it burnt by fire. Wood was storing wood and processing wood. That was a big part of making organs, and so there was a real threat of that. And then he built across the street in what's now Plaza Park off of Main Street. It's right at the bottom of Main Street. It's an open park now. It's across the street from the train station, if you've been down in that area. And that building burned as well, fire, and it was rebuilt. At that time, there was the Carpenter Organ Company was also operating in Brattleboro. He had about 30 employees. Their place burnt down. The employees had to make some decisions. Do we want to go work for Carpenter, or do we want to stick with Estey? And he was able to keep the majority of his employees. They worked feverishly to get the building back, and they were able to rebound pretty quickly from that. In fact, they were having such success, and we'll talk about that a little bit. They built another factory in 1866 on Flat Street. And so for a period of time, from 1866 until 1869, they were actually operating two places in town here, two pretty big places, creating organs. And then there was a flood, a major flood in town, and the one on the bottom left, it wasn't destroyed, but the underpinnings, the foundation of it, it was unsafe, and it had to be rebuilt. And so in 1870, he bought up on the hill and at the Burr Street complex, and that was built then. We're going to work through a little bit of a timeline for questions. You can read that. I'm not going to read it to you. The highlight, Riley Burdett, Levi Fuller, and Josiah D. Whitney. We'll be talking about them as this goes on. They were, again, Jacob Estey could not play the instrument, didn't really know much about how it was put together initially, learned a lot, but his strength was being a manager and a business owner and a person who could work with a lot of people and keep them going. His strength was not knowing how to build them or how to deal with the technology as technology changed. These three men, Riley Burdett, Levi Fuller, and Josiah D. Whitney, really carried that side of the business. You can see what I try to do is just show how the business brings more people in. And where it was started with 18, it went to 30, then it goes to 60. And Josiah D. Whitney, all right, here's a quiz. You're the Reed Estey organ experts. What's his strength? What does he bring? In my other life, I teach middle school kids. Josiah D. Whitney, what does he bring?
Reed machinery.
Oh, yeah, that's the thing. Before this time, they were making reeds by hand. You can't have mass production when how many reeds are in those organs?
122 for a standard parlor organ.
122. There you go. And they're making them by hand. And guess what? Josiah D. Whitney spends about 15 years. He grows up his dad is an organ manufacturer. He grows up in the trade. He starts to specialize about 15 years before this in trying to come up with a machine that will actually start making these reeds and punching them out. And he comes up with one. Estey finds out about it. And he goes and he says, I want to hire you and I want to buy your machine. Whitney's living in Massachusetts at the time. This is it. This is the beginning of Estey as we know it. Josiah D. Whitney joins. All of a sudden, mass production becomes a possibility. They can crank them out. And it's because of this technology that happens. And so, with this boom in technology, Estey has to make some decisions. What am I going to do? At this time, right before this, he had already branched out, and he had a branch working in Chicago, and Burdett had gone there to run with Silas Waite, a branch of Estey organ. Meanwhile, Jacob Estey has a son, J.J. Estey, who is now coming of age, and he also has a son-in-law who's been working in the business and has a good mechanical and musical affinity towards what's going on. And so he's got to taking over and separating the Chicago business. And Estey reorganizes, and he brings Levi Fuller, his son-in-law, and his son, J.J. Estey, in as partners, and the three of them, and that's probably what you mostly recognize as what Estey organ was. That's the beginning of it. And what precipitates all this is the fact that they can get a lot more reeds a lot more quickly, and they can start manufacturing at a much larger rate. And so the workforce jumps to 160 from, more than, it's like triples within just a couple years as this idea of mass production takes hold. Now, the Baptist Church. And Estey comes here to Brattleboro. There's a movement within the community when Estey is still in his 20s to bring the Baptist faith here. And he strongly supports it. He becomes one of the first 2 deacons of the church when it's just getting established. And then he is their financial steward. And he helps raise the money to build this church, which cost $50,000 when it was built. Think about what that would be today. And it had the largest bell in Vermont when it was installed. So Estey goes big. And he goes big by raising a lot of money and bringing in other folks in the community who are interested in a more social justice spirited version of religion than what the Congregationalists were pitching in this community at that time. So at that time, Baptists were coming to Brattleboro, and they were going hard for social justice, looking out for those who didn't have as much. And they were also opposed to slavery, and they were pushing that hard. And meanwhile, the Congregationalists, the leadership of the Congregationalist Church was saying, if we don't have slavery, then this country's going to fall apart. And if you're really patriotic, then you may not think much about slavery. But if you think favorably that this country should remain a country, then we cannot get rid of slavery. And that was the message that was coming from the pulpit of the Congregational Church, as opposed to what the Baptists were pitching at that time. And Estey goes all in. He's not the only one. There's another very wealthy person, black women, as students, and he wanted them to have a good place to stay while they were attending, and so he did that as well. So that's the religious part to this. Then this crazy thing happens to Brattleboro. There's a gigantic flood. That's the picture on the left. That's looking up the Whetstone Brook, and what's missing there right before the falls is the bridge that connects one end of Main Street to the other. And the Estey Organ Company is on the left-hand side, and it has received some damage as that flood came through. And then there's a fire on Main Street. And because some of the fire equipment is stored on the other side of Main Street that no longer has a bridge, the response to the fire is not swift enough. And the picture on the right-hand side is the west side of Main Street. It was full of wooden buildings. You can see the Baptist church in the distance there. It had just been constructed. It was still being constructed, actually, at that time. And everything was gone. And so the community was in trouble. Estey had lost the ability to work in both factories for a period of time that he had. He had one on Flat Street, which was flooded. He had this one that was right on the Main Street corner, which was also damaged. And Main Street was wiped out. And so he decides to move up on the hill to Burr Street, and he just goes all in. And there were 3 people in the community that were very financially powerful who went all in. Estey was one, and he did his work by going up on the hill and building this complex. And then there was a man named Crosby and a man named Brooks, and they both rebuilt that Main Street that you saw that was devastated. And now when you travel up and down Main Street, everything that's on the west side of Main Street is because those 2 people put it back together. And they reinvested in the community. They were both from here. people in the community actually went to Boston and talked to financing organizations there and said, can you help out? And nobody was willing to try to bring the town back. And so it was these three men who really, with their financial wherewithal, because of the success they had, that allowed that to go on. And so Estey decides he's going to go big. He has 225 people that are now working for him, and he's bought a farm that's a little south of this building up on the hill, and he turns that farm into building lots. And he tells his employees, I will carry mortgages, I will help you purchase the property, and then you will build what you want to build on that land. And about half of that Estey, what becomes Esteyville, are employees of the business. And then there are also other people in the community that look and see this as a good place to expand to, and they buy in as well. And so Esteyville sits up on that hill right behind the complex. You can see how things grow as time goes on. 1872, the workforce is 350. It jumps to 512. That's 800 number, or it says 1874 to 1890, the workforce between 500 and 800. That 800 number is probably a little far out there. I've only found that in one place, but because I found it in one place, it was in Dennis Waring's book. I thought I would put it in there. Most people put it more towards 750. But you can see that the company began to prosper. 200,000 reed organs built by 1888. Jacob Estey dies in 1890. 1 out of every 10 people who live in the community by this time are directly employed by the Estey company. Estey is the largest employer in the whole state. And what Estey did, he had a lot of contract employees as well. So people who, and I put that picture in because it shows that, there were a lot of people who ran a wagon and had some horses, and they would contract with Estey, and they would transport. They wouldn't be Estey employees. They wouldn't be counted on their payroll, but they would have, so it was way more than just 1 out of every 10 residents who were impacted by this company.
Did Jacob drop his other trading enterprises, granted, and
He dropped out of that, yes, probably around in the 1850s, late 1850s. Good. Now, some of the people that actually drove this business, other than someone with the last name of Estey. Riley Burdett, that's a drawing of him in his older years. He went on to become an organ manufacturer in his own right. He stayed in Chicago and kept the business going until the Chicago fire. He built organs there, and then he moved to Pennsylvania, and he built organs until his wife died, and then he retired. And his estate was valued at about $85,000 at his death. So the thing that Riley Burdett was good at was everything that Jacob Estey was not good at. And so they were a good partnership. Riley Burdett was a skilled machinist, and he had a lot of musical, he was very musically talented. And so for 20 years, the first 20 years of Estey, Burdett was really he was the supervisor of the manufacturing concern. And Jacob Estey did the marketing and networking and all that sort of stuff. And Burdett really drove that piece of it. Levi Fuller, he's I don't know. Do any of you have an opinion of Levi Fuller before I start talking about him? Levi Fuller's his son-in-law. Well, I want to back up. I like this. Well, I don't like. I think this is an important part of the story. Riley Burdett, he was also someone who was farmed out as a youth. From 9 until 16, he was working for someone else, not because he wanted to be, but because that's what his family arranged for him. And he was under contract for those years. And the deal was the farmer would provide room, food, and clothing, and he would get 3 months of education in the winter. And that was the contract that was signed, and that was until he was 16. When he got to be 16, he then got to go out on his own. And again, he was musically gifted, and so on the side, he would be working, but then he would also be singing and playing violin and giving lessons in those areas. He ends up apprenticing with a machinist, so he learns the building side of organ manufacture as well, and he jumps in and does what he does. But Levi Fuller. So in Brattleboro, he has a checkered history. He becomes the governor of Vermont at one point. He's lieutenant governor while Jacob Estey is still alive. He goes out on his own, he's 13. He is mechanically gifted. He can build stuff, and he ends up creating pitch. Someone want to explain that better than me?
Maybe like concert pitch, that type of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, he developed that.
He developed it. He created universal pitch. That was one of the things and then everything was tuned to that pitch. Somehow he was able to figure that out. But he starts working for Estey, and it's shown that he has a gift for building stuff, and he has a good sense of music, and he works his way up in the business. He marries the boss's daughter in 1865. He becomes a partner in the organization in 1867. He has over 100 patents for organs, railroad mechanics, and sewing machines, so he's diverse in his interests. Some people locally say that all those patents weren't really his ideas, that he was also gifted at taking other people's ideas and claiming them for his own. And again, there's good and bad about who he was as a person, but he did a lot for the business. And when he came in, Riley Burdett became more expendable because he had some of the same gifts that Riley Burdett had. And then this is, the hero of the story, the secret of Estey's success, Josiah D. Whitney. He began working for his father. He was a reed organ maker in Massachusetts. They start making organs in Springfield, Mass. Together, they partner up after he learns the trade from his dad. His dad sees, hey, this guy really gets it, and they form an equal partnership. Then he starts specializing in making reeds with a machine. No one else is really having success with that. And Estey finds out about it, hires him. He works for Estey from 1865 to 1874. Estey buys the machinery. And right in the middle there, I should have bolded it. This is probably the most important thing. Josiah D. Whitney designed all 3 generations of reed-making machinery that Estey operated for the whole time that company was making reeds. And so Josiah D. Whitney's hand was in every reed that was produced. There were 3 generations of machines. Josiah D. Whitney designed the first while he was working for Estey. He designed the second, and Estey bought it. And then the third one, Estey actually ended up buying from another company that Josiah D. Whitney had contracted with. And so all of the reeds were made. Those machines were modified over time by the workers at Estey, but his was the hand that started it. Other people that worked there. The reeds, again, most important part of the machine, many people think. Carrie L. Smith was a reed filer. She's the woman in the middle of that group. These are all employees of Estey who've been there for more than 50 years. And Estey, one of the things that's said about him positively is that he employed men and women and paid them equal rates at a time when that wasn't really a thing in most of the United States. And there's a story about how he was challenged by some of the male workers, and he said, it doesn't really matter to me who's doing the filing of these reeds. It matters whether musically they perform at the rate they need to. And so if women do it as well as you do, and in fact, Estey would argue that women were better at it than men if he was asked. And so that changed the dynamic within the business. The reed filing part of the business was the only part that was never allowed for tours. You could tour any other part of the Estey facility, but they never allowed tours in that room where those machines were. It was proprietary. It was what made Estey different, and he didn't want anybody going in there to figure out how it worked. One of the things that was a hallmark of Estey employees was they were loyal. Estey was loyal to his employees. He paid them a fair wage. They, in turn, almost nothing was written down. If you are someone who's tried to research the Estey Oregon company, you will find that there are almost no documents until they went into bankruptcy in the 1930s. And that's because employee passed on to employee verbally what the task was and how to do it. And that was part of keeping Estey different than everybody else, so that they couldn't take papers and sell them somewhere else. You needed to learn the business if you were going to be working there. Charles Henkel, women were employed and so were immigrants. Again, Estey was looking for people with specific skills. Charles Henkel was a German immigrant who was a wood carver. He was gifted and became the major designer during Jacob Estey's lifetime, especially of the ornate organs that you see around that have the Estey name on them. If it's really fancy, it was probably designed by this guy. And these are some of the plans. You can see the detail that he would go into and how the designs were put together. This is the story for those of us from Vermont. You can read the caption there. Basically, the story is there's 3 farm boys in northern Vermont who are looking for work. And they come to Brattleboro because the word's out that if you have skills and you can come here and you can demonstrate that you want to work, Estey will hire you. 2 of the 3 boys come and work just long enough to make enough money so they can go back and buy their own farms. And that's what they do. And then the 3rd one, Marshall, who's pictured there with the hat. There's a lot of them with hats, but you see his name. And he stays in Brattleboro, and he's probably the longest employee at the Estey Oregon Company. And he lives to be 103. He doesn't retire until he's 95. And so that goes again to some of the loyalty. Not all employees, and Estey had the best relationships, but this is pretty unique. And so one of the things when you go through the history of Estey and you look at the local papers, you'll see that this was something that was promoted by the company. We have this many employees who've been here for 30 years. We have this many employees who've been here for 50 years. And that was part of the deal. And so, and they lived in the same houses, they lived on William Street. And so it was a stable job. It didn't fluctuate that much. The number of employees went up and down a bit over time, but it hovered around 700 for about 40 years. And for most people, that's a working life.
It looks like you had some children down there on the right, working. Don't they look young?
Yep. Yeah. And again, there are all kinds of tasks. So one of the things that I didn't really think of, but until I read about it, was the amount of wood, the amount of lumber that they went through. And how when you walk around the Estey site, you've got to imagine that in the back were just piles and piles of wood. And there was a process, and young people like that was part of their job, they would maintain the wood, and they would season it for a period of time, and then they would bring it into the building, and they would keep it in a heat-sensitive building for a period of time until they got to a point where they thought the wood was ready to actually become part of an organ. And that process would go for a year to a year and a half. And so there was a lot involved in putting these instruments together. It wasn't, so that's why everybody who worked there thought they had a skill that was unique. And in many ways they did. And that ends our presentation.